Before the sword fell on the neck of England's most infamous queen, her husband had already destroyed everything that made her human. They didn't just want to kill Anne Boleyn, they wanted to make her a warning. This is the story of the woman who changed England forever, and how the most powerful man in the kingdom turned her into a symbol of treason, lust, and downfall. Forget the royal feasts and jewels of the Tudor court. Our story begins in the dark, cold chambers of the Tower of London, where Anne waited for the blade that would end both her life and her revolution. Before Anne Boleyn became England's most infamous queen, she was just a well-educated noblewoman serving at court, one among many. Her story didn't begin with love, it began with strategy. Born around 51 to Thomas Boleyn, an ambitious diplomat, and Elizabeth Howard, Anne was raised not for affection but for opportunity. Her family's position in Tudor society was comfortable but not secure. The English court under King Henry VIII was a dangerous mix of politics, ambition, and survival. For families like the Boleyns, advancement depended on charm, alliances, and proximity to power. As a teenager, Anne was sent abroad first to the Netherlands, then to the glittering French court of Queen Claude. There she witnessed refinement, diplomacy, and the subtle weaponization of beauty and wit. She learned French, music, fashion, and courtly behavior skills that would later make her stand out in England's far more rigid environment. Contemporary accounts describe her as not conventionally beautiful but striking, dark eyes, sharp intelligence, and an unusual confidence that intimidated men more than it charmed them. When she returned to England in 1522, she was not a naive girl. She was a product of Europe's most cultured courts, prepared for the game of influence. Anne first entered service as lady-in-waiting to Queen Catherine of Aragon, Henry VIII's long-suffering Spanish wife. At that time, the queen was in her 30s, and Henry's interest in his marriage had already cooled after years of failed attempts to produce a male heir. The atmosphere was tense. Every noble family wanted their daughters close to the royal couple. Power flowed from whoever captured the king's attention. Henry had already had an affair with Anne's older sister, Mary Boleyn. When Anne appeared at court, the king took notice, but this time the pursuit would not be easy. Unlike other women in Henry's circle, Anne refused him. Letters later discovered show that when Henry began sending her gifts and love notes, she deliberately kept him at a distance. "Your Majesty's servant," she called herself, never his mistress. She understood the risk. Becoming the king's mistress meant temporary power but permanent disgrace. Her refusal only intensified his obsession. By 1526, Henry was openly infatuated. His letters to Anne 17, of which still survive, reveal a man desperate, jealous, and possessive. "I beg to know what place I hold in your heart," he wrote, a striking admission for a king used to control. But Anne was not playing the role of romantic victim. She was calculating. She knew Henry's desire could be leveraged into something far greater than wealth or status, marriage itself. For a woman of her rank, such ambition bordered on treason. Yet Anne understood Henry's ego. He wanted what he could not have. Over the next 7 years, their relationship turned from courtly flirtation into political crisis. Henry, still married to Catherine, petitioned the Pope for annulment. His justification was biblical. He claimed their marriage was cursed because Catherine had been his brother's widow, but everyone at court knew the truth. It was not divine guilt driving him. It was Anne Boleyn. The Pope's refusal created a diplomatic and religious standoff that reshaped Europe. Henry's advisors warned that defying Rome would isolate England from Catholic powers, but Anne's influence only deepened. She surrounded herself with scholars sympathetic to Protestant reformers, men like Thomas Cranmer and reformist thinkers who criticized papal authority. Whether she truly believed in religious reform or used it as political leverage remains debated, but it gave Henry the justification he needed. By 1531, Henry separated from Queen Catherine. The queen was banished from court, and her daughter, Princess Mary, declared illegitimate. The move shocked Europe and enraged the Vatican. Henry and Anne's relationship now became a matter of national rebellion. Every sermon, every pamphlet, every diplomatic message revolved around the king's great matter, his attempt to marry the woman who had divided the church. Meanwhile, Anne's public image began to fracture. The people of England, devoted to Catherine, viewed Anne as a seductress, a manipulator, even a witch. Pamphlets circulated accusing her of using sorcery to entrap the king. Her enemies in court, especially conservative Catholics, saw her as the root of heresy and chaos. Yet Henry's obsession only grew stronger. He awarded Anne titles, estates, and influence unmatched by any woman before her. In 1533, Anne secretly married Henry. She was already pregnant, and the king could no longer wait for Rome's approval. When the Archbishop of Canterbury declared the marriage valid under English, not papal law, it marked the official beginning of England's break from the Catholic Church. Henry crowned himself head of the Church of England, forever severing the nation's ties with Rome. In June that same year, Anne was crowned queen in a lavish ceremony at Westminster Abbey. The gold-embroidered gown, the parade through London, and the cheers of courtiers masked the truth. The new queen was already one of the most hated women in England. Her coronation, intended to symbolize renewal, only deepened resentment. Ordinary citizens refused to celebrate. In some parts of London, crowds jeered as her procession passed. For them, Catherine had been a virtuous queen, Anne an intruder. Behind the spectacle of her coronation lay a grim reality. She had exchanged security for power and affection for fear. When her child was born that September, Henry was expecting a son, the long-awaited heir to secure the Tudor dynasty. Instead, it was a girl, Elizabeth. The disappointment was immediate, though history would later turn that moment into poetic irony. Henry hid his frustration at first, but those close to the court noticed the change. His letters became colder, his patience shorter. Anne's triumph, once absolute, was already beginning to unravel. By the time the christening ended, Anne had learned what every queen eventually does. In Tudor England, a woman's worth was measured not by her mind or courage, but by the sons she could give her king. The countdown to her downfall had quietly begun. Anne Boleyn's coronation was supposed to mark a new golden age for England. Instead, it became the opening act of a national crisis. Henry VIII's decision to defy the Pope and marry Anne was more than a scandal. It was an act of political defiance that split his kingdom in half. For the first time in history, England had separated itself from the authority of Rome. What began as a royal love affair had turned into a revolution. And Anne, the new queen, was its most visible symbol and its most vulnerable target. From the moment she became queen, Anne faced hostility on all fronts. The people viewed her as the destroyer of their beloved Queen Catherine of Aragon, who had served England for more than 2 decades. Catherine's quiet dignity in exile only made Anne appear more heartless. When Anne rode through London, crowds shouted insults instead of blessings. Some threw rotten fruit. Others held up banners calling her the king's whore. She understood that the crown on her head came with no love from the people, only suspicion. But Anne wasn't just hated outside the palace walls. Inside, the court was divided. Half of the nobility still supported Catherine and the old faith. The other half, reformists, opportunists, and ambitious families, aligned themselves with Anne, seeing her as the key to influence in this New England. This invisible war turned every dinner, every council, and every ceremony into a battlefield. The Queen's sharp intelligence, which once attracted Henry, began to make him uncomfortable. She had opinions about policy, religion, and statecraft, matters women were expected to avoid. Anne often argued with ministers, advised Henry on diplomatic matters, and took an interest in religious reform. She promoted scholars who supported translating the Bible into English, and she protected reformers accused of heresy. Her enemies called her a heretic. Her supporters saw her as enlightened. Either way, her influence was undeniable, and that made her dangerous. In 1534, Henry's break with Rome became official. Parliament passed the Act of Supremacy, declaring the king the only supreme head on earth of the Church of England. Those who refused to swear loyalty to this act were branded traitors. Among them was Sir Thomas More, once Henry's close friend and one of England's most respected men. When More refused to acknowledge Anne as queen, he was executed. His death shocked Europe. To Anne's enemies, she was now directly responsible for the death of saints and scholars. The propaganda machine against her accelerated. At the same time, Anne's position at court began to weaken in more subtle ways. Henry's affection, once consuming, had cooled. The king was restless, frustrated that Anne had not produced a son. Every pregnancy became a test of her worth. In 1534, she miscarried a child. Courtiers whispered that it was punishment from God. The same clergy who once supported Henry's divorce now called his new marriage cursed. The people, seeing the turbulence in their country, took Catherine's side more firmly than ever. Catherine herself, though banished to remote castles, remained a powerful figure in the hearts of the English people. Her refusal to renounce her marriage and her steady devotion to her faith made her a symbol of resistance. Anne knew it and feared it. Every time the king received news from Catherine's household, Anne suspected betrayal. The pressure made her temper volatile. Witnesses later described her outbursts as intense, especially when she felt threatened by the mention of Catherine or Princess Mary. Anne's relationship with Princess Mary became one of the most personal and visible signs of her unpopularity. Henry had declared Mary illegitimate, but Anne saw her as a living reminder of everything the public loved about the old queen. When Mary refused to acknowledge her as queen, Anne demanded that she be punished. Henry agreed, isolating his daughter further. To the outside world, this was proof of Anne's cruelty. What few understood was that Anne herself lived under constant psychological strain. Every miscarriage, every insult, every rumor chipped away at her control. Her one remaining source of comfort was her daughter, Elizabeth. Despite her disappointment at not giving birth to a son, Anne was fiercely devoted to her child. She ensured Elizabeth had the finest tutors and even secured for her a place in the line of succession through new legal acts. But Henry's focus had shifted. He began spending more time away from her, and new faces began to appear at court, particularly that of a quiet, obedient young woman named Jane Seymour, one of Anne's own ladies-in-waiting. By 1535, Anne sensed danger. She was still queen, but her influence over Henry was slipping. Her opponents, led by Thomas Cromwell, saw their chance. Cromwell, once her ally, had become her rival in controlling the king's policy. Anne wanted to use church wealth to fund education and charity. Cromwell wanted to fill the royal treasury. Their clash wasn't personal at first, it was political. But Henry's growing dissatisfaction gave Cromwell the upper hand. Meanwhile, England was growing unstable. The break from Rome led to uprisings and executions. Religious persecution increased. Monasteries were being dissolved, priests imprisoned, and thousands displaced. For the first time in centuries, ordinary people questioned their king's moral authority. Anne became the convenient scapegoat for it all, blamed for influencing Henry toward tyranny. Pamphlets circulated claiming she bewitched the king, using charms and poisons to manipulate him. Even in foreign courts, Anne's reputation was toxic. The Holy Roman Emperor, Catherine's nephew, refused to recognize her as queen. The Pope denounced her marriage as invalid. France, once Henry's ally, distanced itself. Every alliance England had built was cracking, and Anne's name was at the center of the blame. At home, her paranoia deepened. She dismissed servants for disloyalty, confronted ministers, and even argued publicly with the king. Henry, who once found her fiery nature irresistible, now saw it as defiance. Their private arguments became public gossip. His eyes were already turning toward Jane Seymour, quiet, submissive, and everything Anne was not. By the end of 1535, Anne had gone from the most powerful woman in England to a queen surrounded by enemies. The same intelligence, confidence, and independence that once drew the king to her had now made her dangerous in his eyes. Henry no longer saw a partner, he saw a liability. The political machinery that had once raised Anne Boleyn to the throne was now quietly preparing to destroy her. By 1536, Anne Boleyn's power had reached its breaking point. The political machine that had elevated her now turned against her with surgical precision. Her failure to give Henry a son had not only weakened her personal standing, but also threatened the stability of the Tudor dynasty itself. Every miscarriage was interpreted as divine disapproval, and every argument with the king was twisted into evidence of witchcraft, arrogance, or treason. England's queen was surrounded by people who smiled at her in public and plotted her downfall in private. Her greatest enemy was no longer Queen Catherine or the Catholic Church. It was Thomas Cromwell, the king's chief minister and master strategist. Once allies, Cromwell and Anne had collaborated to advance reformist causes and consolidate royal power. But as England's new church took shape, they diverged sharply. Anne wanted the wealth from dissolved monasteries to be used for education and social welfare. Cromwell wanted that money to flow directly into the royal treasury and, by extension, into his own network of influence. Their ideological clash soon turned personal. Henry, tired of Anne's outbursts and humiliated by her miscarriages, began giving Cromwell quiet permission to solve the problem. No official order was ever recorded, but Henry's pattern of avoidance made his intentions clear. He did not have the courage to confront Anne directly. Instead, Cromwell was allowed to engineer her destruction. The opportunity came in January 1536. On the 7th, Queen Catherine of Aragon died, the woman whose existence had haunted Anne for a decade. For a moment, Anne believed this was her victory. She was finally the only recognized queen. But the celebrations were short-lived. Just weeks later, Anne suffered a final miscarriage. The fetus reportedly a boy, around 15 weeks old. The king's reaction was chilling. According to witnesses, he told courtiers that he had been bewitched into marriage and declared, "I see that God will not give me sons by her." From that day, Anne's fate was sealed. Cromwell understood the king's mood and moved swiftly. He began assembling a network of informants, courtiers, and opportunists willing to testify against the queen. His goal was simple: fabricate a case that could legally justify her execution. But such a charge had to be serious enough to erase sympathy and silence critics. Cromwell chose treason and adultery, crimes punishable by death. The groundwork began in whispers. Cromwell interrogated musicians, courtiers, and servants who had been close to the queen. Among them was Mark Smeaton, a court musician and commoner. Historical records suggest he was arrested, likely tortured, and forced to confess to an affair with Anne. Once Smeaton's confession existed, Cromwell had the foundation he needed. The next step was to implicate men of noble birth, ensuring that Anne's fall would also destroy her political allies. He selected Henry Norris, Sir Francis Weston, William Brereton, and George Boleyn, Anne's own brother. The accusations were constructed with deliberate absurdity, dates and locations that contradicted known events, alleged trysts during times when Anne was pregnant or recovering from childbirth. But logic no longer mattered. What Cromwell needed was not truth, only the appearance of guilt. By April 1536, rumors began circulating that the queen had grown too familiar with her courtiers. The king, outwardly calm, had already distanced himself emotionally. His attention had turned fully toward Jane Seymour, the quiet and compliant lady-in-waiting who represented everything Anne was not. He sent her gifts, the same kind he had once sent to Anne. To observers, the pattern was unmistakable. One queen was being prepared for execution, the next for coronation. On April 30th, Smeaton was formally arrested. Within 48 hours, Norris, Weston, and Brereton were taken into custody. Their interrogations were brutal and controlled by Cromwell's men. By May 2nd, Anne was summoned to the royal apartments and informed she was accused of adultery and conspiracy against the king. She was stunned. Historical accounts describe her as trembling, confused, and unable to comprehend the accusations. She swore her innocence, claiming, "I would rather die 1,000 deaths than betray my husband." But Henry had already withdrawn his protection. Anne was arrested and taken to the Tower of London, the same fortress where she had once watched others fall from grace. She entered through the Traitor's Gate, symbolizing that she was no longer the queen, but a prisoner of the crown. Ironically, the room she was confined in was the same royal apartment where she had awaited her coronation 3 years earlier. The symbolism was cruel and deliberate, from queen to condemned within the same walls. Meanwhile, Cromwell finalized the evidence. He personally dictated the details of Anne's alleged affairs, even specifying times and dates. The supposed lovers were accused of conspiring to kill the king so Anne could marry one of them. The charges were so implausible that even foreign ambassadors wrote to their rulers expressing disbelief. The Spanish ambassador, Eustace Chapuis, who had despised Anne for years, admitted that, "Never has a poor woman been so unjustly treated." But Cromwell's plan was never about truth. It was about removing a political obstacle and pleasing a volatile king. He orchestrated every stage of Anne's public humiliation. On May 15, 1536, Anne was tried before a jury of peers, including her uncle, the Duke of Norfolk, and other men who owed their positions to Cromwell or feared the king's wrath. She defended herself intelligently, questioning the inconsistencies in the accusations, but it didn't matter. The verdict had been decided before she entered the courtroom. She was declared guilty of adultery, incest, and treason. Her brother George, tried separately, was accused of an incestuous relationship with her, a charge so grotesque it shocked even Anne's enemies. Both were sentenced to death. The noblemen were ordered to be beheaded, the commoners hanged, drawn, and quartered. The trials lasted 2 days. The decision to destroy Anne Boleyn had taken months to engineer and only hours to conclude. By the end of May 5036, the court that once celebrated Anne's rise now turned silent. No one dared speak her name openly. Henry prepared to marry Jane Seymour even before the execution date was set. Cromwell had delivered exactly what the king wanted: a clean slate, a political justification, and a reminder that even queens could bleed under Tudor law. The enemies had gathered, struck, and won. But what they didn't realize was that in destroying Anne, they had also changed the monarchy forever, replacing love with fear and setting a precedent for royal cruelty that would echo through every reign that followed. Anne Boleyn's trial was never meant to uncover truth. It was designed to display power. The proceedings at the Tower of London in May 1536 were a calculated performance orchestrated to humiliate her, justify her execution, and cleanse the monarchy of controversy. Every stage of the trial, from the composition of the jury to the reading of the charges, was controlled by the same people who had engineered her downfall. On May 15, 1536, Anne was brought before a panel of 26 peers in the King's Hall of the Tower. The presiding officer was her own uncle, Thomas Howard, Duke of Norfolk, a man known more for political survival than mercy. The jury included men whose fortunes depended on King Henry's favor and whose fear of the king outweighed any sense of justice. The outcome was predetermined. Anne wasn't attending a trial, she was attending her own condemnation. The charges against her were grave: adultery, incest, and treason. The prosecution claimed she had engaged in multiple affairs with 5 men, including her brother, George Boleyn, and that together they had conspired to kill the king so Anne could remarry. No evidence supported these claims. The supposed dates of her crimes contradicted known records. Some alleged meetings occurred when she was pregnant or confined after childbirth. Others took place when she wasn't even present at the royal court, but logic had no role in this trial. It was about perception. Thomas Cromwell had ensured that each accusation was detailed enough to shock, yet vague enough to make denial seem pointless. He also understood the importance of public reaction. Ambassadors and nobles were invited to witness the trial, ensuring that word of Anne's disgrace would spread across Europe. The goal wasn't just to punish her, it was to destroy her image, her legacy, and the legitimacy of her child, Princess Elizabeth. Anne's defense was remarkable given her circumstances. Dressed in a plain black gown with a white coif, she addressed the court directly, calm, articulate, and unwavering. She denied every charge and demanded to confront her accusers. When she was told she could not, she reminded the court that the evidence presented was not only inconsistent but impossible. According to multiple witnesses, she spoke with such dignity and boldness that several men were moved to tears. Her brother George's trial followed shortly after. He too denied the charges, mocking the absurdity of the incest accusation. When the prosecution read aloud a supposed conversation between the siblings, in which Anne allegedly discussed the king's sexual performance, George pointed out that no witness could confirm such words had ever been spoken. His intelligence and defiance embarrassed the court, but defiance was useless. The verdicts were already sealed. Both Anne and George were found guilty. The Duke of Norfolk pronounced the sentence in words that would echo through history. "Because thou hast offended against our sovereign lord the king's grace in committing treason against his person, the law of the realm is that thou hast deserved death, to be burned or beheaded, as shall please the king." The distinction, burn or behead, was not a matter of mercy, but royal mood. Henry VIII later commuted Anne's sentence to beheading, an act he portrayed as compassion. In reality, it was a calculated gesture to maintain the illusion of justice. Anne would be executed by a French swordsman, not the traditional English axe, supposedly at her own request. The choice was symbolic, clean, efficient, and foreign, just like the woman Henry now wished to erase. After the trial, Anne returned to her cell in the Tower. Despite the horror of her situation, she maintained composure. Reports from guards and ladies-in-waiting describe her as cheerful in spirit, even joking about her small neck, saying it would be easily done. But beneath the calm, she knew the truth. The charges were political theater, her death a formality. Henry was already preparing to marry Jane Seymour, the woman waiting in the shadows of court. Foreign ambassadors who observed the events sent scathing reports to their monarchs. The imperial ambassador Eustace Chapuis, who had once despised Anne, wrote to Emperor Charles V that she had been condemned without valid proof, and that the king will have his will, be it right or wrong. Even enemies recognized the injustice. Anne's trial marked a turning point in English history. It was the first time a reigning queen had been publicly tried and executed on fabricated charges. It demonstrated that under Henry VIII, loyalty, family ties, and even innocence could not protect anyone from royal wrath. By the evening of May 15th, the verdict had spread across London. Bells did not ring, no celebrations were held. Even those who hated her were unsettled by how swiftly the king had destroyed his wife. Behind the walls of the Tower, Anne prepared for the end with the same intelligence and dignity that had once made her queen. Her trial was complete, but her true punishment, the public execution that would erase her name from history, was still to come. At dawn on May 19, 1536, Anne Boleyn woke knowing she would die before the sun reached its height. Her final hours were recorded in detail by the officials and guards who attended her, evidence not of compassion, but of control. Every movement, every word, every breath was monitored. Henry VIII wanted a flawless execution, free from the public chaos that had marked the deaths of lesser traitors. Even in death, Anne's image had to be managed. In the early morning, the constable of the Tower, Sir William Kingston, informed her that the executioner had arrived. The man had come from Calais, a French swordsman reputed for precision. Henry had personally ordered him, perhaps as a final gesture of irony. The woman who had replaced an English queen with a French-influenced charm would now die by a French blade. Anne thanked Kingston and reportedly said, "I hear he is very skillful, and I have but a little neck." It was the kind of remark that chilled witnesses, calm, almost detached, yet fully aware. Her execution had been delayed once, reportedly because the king wanted confirmation that the Frenchman was ready. During that delay, Anne spent the night in prayer. She asked her attendants not to weep, reminding them that she was going to meet her end in peace. The composure she displayed in her final moments contrasted sharply with the narrative her enemies had built. She was not hysterical or resentful. She was, as one observer noted, more like a woman preparing for a royal audience than one facing death. Shortly before 9 a.m., Anne was escorted from her chamber to the scaffold built within the Tower grounds. Unlike public executions on Tower Hill, hers was private, attended only by selected witnesses, including a few courtiers, guards, and ladies-in-waiting. Henry had forbidden large crowds. He wanted control of the story that would follow, not the unpredictable reaction of a city still uneasy about the death of its queen. Anne wore a gray damask gown trimmed with ermine, a red petticoat beneath, and a white coif. Her attire was symbolic, regal yet modest. Before kneeling, she removed her headdress and replaced it with a linen cap so the executioner would have no obstruction. She handed her small purse to one of her attendants, then knelt upright, without a block. The French method required the condemned to kneel fully, the neck extended, while the swordsman struck from behind. Her final speech was short but deliberate. Witnesses recorded her saying she did not come to accuse anyone but to die faithfully to the king, praying that God would preserve him and give him a long reign. It was not a declaration of guilt. It was an act of submission, necessary for her daughter's survival. Anne knew that her words could determine whether her child, Princess Elizabeth, would live or be quietly removed from succession. Every sentence was calculated for survival beyond her death. She then knelt and repeated the words, "To Jesus Christ I commend my soul. Lord Jesus, receive my spirit." The swordsman waited for his cue. In French, he spoke softly to his assistant, distracting Anne long enough for her to turn her head. The blade fell with a single stroke. Those present reported that it was clean, instant, silent, efficient. Her head was placed on the straw, her body covered with a white cloth. There was no coffin prepared. Her remains were placed in an arrow chest and buried hastily in the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula within the Tower. No royal ceremony followed, no official mourning, and no mention in church services. Within 24 hours, Henry was already making plans for his next marriage. 11 days later, he married Jane Seymour, as if Anne had never existed. The erasure began immediately. Her portraits were removed from royal galleries. Her emblems, the falcon, the Tudor rose intertwined with her initials, were destroyed or replaced. Courtiers who had served her were reassigned to Jane Seymour's household. Elizabeth, now declared illegitimate, was stripped of her title as princess and referred to only as the Lady Elizabeth. The goal was not merely to end Anne's life, but to erase her from the narrative of the Tudor dynasty. Yet, despite Henry's efforts, Anne's death had consequences far beyond his control. In foreign courts, her execution shocked diplomats and reinforced England's reputation for brutality. In Rome, it was seen as divine punishment for Henry's defiance of the Church. In Protestant regions, she became an unintended martyr, a woman executed for her intelligence, conviction, and independence. Historians later noted that her execution marked a shift in how the English monarchy viewed power. Before Anne, queens were symbols, silent partners meant to provide heirs. After Anne, they became political liabilities, vulnerable to manipulation and scapegoating. Henry had established a precedent. No one, not even a queen, was untouchable. Her daughter, Elizabeth I, would later ascend the throne and reign for 45 years, restoring the prestige of the Tudor name. Ironically, it was Anne's bloodline, the one Henry tried to erase, that would define England's golden age. But on that morning in May 1536, none of that could be foreseen. All that remained was the sound of a blade striking, the silence that followed, and the unspoken truth that a queen's death had reshaped the monarchy forever. The death of Anne Boleyn was not the end of her story. It was the beginning of a state-sponsored rewriting of history. Within hours of her execution, the machinery of propaganda began reshaping how England remembered its former queen. Henry VIII understood that public memory could be controlled as effectively as law. He did not simply want Anne gone, he wanted her transformed from a royal consort into a cautionary tale. The first step in rewriting history was silencing the evidence of her reign. Orders were sent to remove her portraits, destroy her badges, and replace her motto, "The Most Happy," with that of Jane Seymour, the new queen. At Hampton Court, workers were instructed to scrape her initials from the walls and furniture. Yet, in a few corners, the intertwined H&A carvings were missed and survive to this day. The effort to erase her was not symbolic, it was administrative. Clerks were told to remove her name from official documents, replacing it with references to the late queen or the traitress. Anne's closest allies were purged from court. Ladies who had served her were reassigned or dismissed. Her family, the Boleyns, faced political exile. Her father, Thomas Boleyn, once one of the most powerful men in England, was stripped of influence and kept at a distance from the king. He never publicly protested his daughter's death. Silence was the price of survival. Within 2 years, he too would be dead, broken, and forgotten. Henry's new marriage was presented as divine justice. Church preachers across England were ordered to deliver sermons condemning Anne's sins and praising the king's decision to cleanse the realm of corruption. Pamphlets described her as a seductress who had led Henry astray, a woman who used witchcraft and deceit to destroy the moral order. These narratives were deliberately circulated to justify not just her death, but Henry's break from Rome. The English Reformation, which had begun as Anne's victory, now became her ghost. Henry's advisors used her downfall to prove that the Church of England was not ruled by feminine influence or heresy. Thomas Cromwell, her chief architect of destruction, became the public face of reform, and he ensured that history would remember Anne only through the accusations he had written. Outside England, the reaction was mixed. European courts, particularly in France and the Holy Roman Empire, viewed Anne's execution as confirmation of England's instability. The French, once her allies, distanced themselves from her memory. In Rome, the Pope cited her fate as divine punishment for adultery and for the schism she had symbolized. No one, not even her enemies, denied the brutality of her end, but few dared to challenge Henry's official narrative. Behind the scenes, however, the erasure was imperfect. Foreign ambassadors recorded the inconsistencies in her charges, noting that even those who had despised her admitted she had died with courage and innocence. Some of these private letters, preserved in archives across Europe, are the only surviving accounts that question the legitimacy of her trial. They describe Anne as intelligent, politically ambitious, and dangerously outspoken, qualities admired by some and feared by others. The manipulation of Anne's memory extended to her daughter. Princess Elizabeth, now declared illegitimate, was removed from the line of succession and raised away from court. Her mother's name was rarely mentioned in official correspondence, and she grew up surrounded by silence. Yet records show that even as a child, Elizabeth asked about her mother, collecting stories from those who had known her. It would take decades, but the daughter of the traitor queen would one day reclaim the power that had destroyed her family. As for Thomas Cromwell, his victory was short-lived. Within 4 years of Anne's death, he too fell from favor. Ironically, it was during his efforts to arrange Henry's fourth marriage that the king turned on him, accusing him of treason and heresy, the same fabricated charges he had once used against Anne. Cromwell was executed in 1540, beheaded on the same scaffold where Anne had died. In a grim symmetry, his own downfall completed the cycle of betrayal he had perfected. Over time, the Tudor court learned to fear Anne's memory. Her name became a political taboo, neither fully condemned nor rehabilitated. Chroniclers wrote cautiously, omitting details that might offend the crown. Only in the next century, under Elizabeth I, did her reputation begin to shift. The new queen, though she rarely spoke of her mother, quietly restored symbols associated with Anne. Her portraits displayed a pendant with the letter A. Her policies favored education, art, and religious moderation, values historians later traced back to Anne's reformist influence. Anne Boleyn's erasure was not absolute. The attempt to destroy her memory inadvertently immortalized her. Every scratched emblem, every altered record, every sermon denouncing her became evidence of her impact. In trying to erase her, Henry's regime preserved the outlines of the woman it feared most, intelligent, independent, and unwilling to submit completely to male authority. By the time historians revisited her story centuries later, Anne had evolved from villain to victim, from manipulative seductress to misunderstood reformer. The Tudor propaganda had faded, but her defiance had not. Even stripped of her crown, accused of crimes she never committed, and buried without a name, Anne Boleyn remained what she had always been, a woman who challenged the structure of power and forced England to reckon with it. The legacy of Anne Boleyn did not die with her body in the chapel floor of the Tower of London. Her bloodline, her ideas, and even the lies told against her continued to shape England for centuries. In destroying her, Henry VIII had unknowingly guaranteed that her influence would outlive him, not through scandal or legend, but through the reign of her daughter Elizabeth I. The Queen, executed as a traitor, would become the mother of one of England's greatest monarchs. When Anne died in 1536, her name was synonymous with disgrace. Official documents described her as the late Queen Anne, stripped of royal dignity. Her daughter, Elizabeth, was declared illegitimate and excluded from succession. Yet Anne had already left behind something more powerful than status, an idea. She had demonstrated that intelligence, conviction, and self-determination could redefine a woman's role in politics. Even her enemies admitted she was unlike any queen before her, educated, outspoken, and unafraid to challenge the men who governed the kingdom. Elizabeth grew up under the shadow of that reputation. Raised away from court and trained under strict tutors, she was constantly reminded of her mother's fate. Every political lesson she learned about loyalty, silence, and perception came filtered through the story of Anne Boleyn. The young princess understood early that words could kill as effectively as swords, and that charm could be both weapon and defense. By the time Elizabeth ascended the throne in 1558, she had mastered the same qualities that once made her mother dangerous. But she used them with precision, never letting emotion override calculation. Anne's death had also reshaped the monarchy itself. Henry VIII's brutal handling of his wives, divorcing, banishing, and executing them, permanently altered the relationship between king and subject. The spectacle of Anne's trial and execution had demonstrated that royal authority was absolute, but it also exposed its fragility. The Tudor court became a place of constant fear, where loyalty was performative and survival depended on silence. That paranoia did not end with Henry. It shaped the political culture Elizabeth inherited, a monarchy that ruled by image as much as by power. Under Elizabeth, Anne's legacy was quietly rehabilitated. The new queen never publicly defended her mother, but she made deliberate gestures that reintroduced Anne's memory into royal imagery. She wore her mother's A pendant in portraits. She surrounded herself with reformist scholars and courtiers who had sympathized with Anne's religious ideals. The Protestant identity of Elizabeth's reign, emphasizing personal conscience, education, and English independence from Rome, mirrored the values Anne had once championed. In this way, the Queen Henry had called the Great Whore became the silent architect of England's golden age. Historians have long debated Anne's true nature. Some early writers, influenced by Tudor propaganda, portrayed her as manipulative and ambitious, a woman who used seduction to climb to power. Later historians, especially in the 19th and 20th centuries, revisited her life with a more critical eye, revealing how much of that reputation was manufactured to justify her execution. Records show that Anne was a patron of the arts and education, fluent in several languages, and a supporter of religious reform long before it was politically convenient. Far from being a pawn, she had been an active force in shaping the early English Reformation, a reality her enemies could never fully erase. Her death also exposed the double standard that defined women in power. Anne was condemned for qualities celebrated in men: ambition, influence, and conviction. Henry's actions, divorcing one wife, marrying another, and executing her when she failed to produce a son, were tolerated as royal prerogative. Anne's assertiveness, however, was labeled treasonous. Her story became a historical case study in how female power is punished when it refuses to conform. Centuries later, her name resurfaced in art, literature, and political commentary. Writers from Nicholas Sander to Agnes Strickland reinvented her for their own times, as a villain, a martyr, or a feminist icon. Modern historians, examining original court records and diplomatic correspondence, have found that most of the accusations against her were fabricated. Even her supposed lovers were convicted on testimony that contradicted basic fact. What remains indisputable is that Anne was executed not for adultery, but for defiance. In the broader scope of history, her legacy is paradoxical. She was destroyed by the monarchy, yet her daughter redefined it. She was erased from records, yet her influence became impossible to ignore. The child who watched her mother's name dragged through the mud would later command a kingdom that spanned oceans, proving that Anne's downfall had not been in vain. Elizabeth's reign turned the Tudor name from scandal to supremacy, and with it, her mother's memory was quietly restored. Anne Boleyn's story also reshaped how later generations viewed monarchy itself. Her execution demonstrated that royal power was not divine but human, emotional, political, and cruel. It revealed that kings could act out of insecurity, not justice. That lesson influenced how the English viewed authority for centuries, from the Civil War to the rise of constitutional monarchy. Today, historians recognize Anne not just as a victim of Tudor politics, but as a transformative figure, a woman whose intellect and ambition forced a king to change the structure of religion and government. She became a catalyst for an era that would define modern England. Her blood was spilled in silence, but her ideas survived through the child she left behind. More than 400 years after her death, Anne Boleyn's story remains one of power, manipulation, and endurance. She was condemned as a traitor, executed as a criminal, and erased as a queen, yet remembered as something far greater, the woman who altered the course of English history without ever lifting a sword. Her life proved that influence does not always survive through victory. Sometimes it survives through the echo of injustice. For centuries after her execution, Anne Boleyn was remembered through the distorted lens crafted by her enemies. The Tudor propaganda that followed her death painted her as a scheming temptress who had destroyed a marriage, corrupted a king, and brought ruin to England's spiritual order. But over time, as access to historical records expanded and attitudes toward women in power evolved, Anne's image began to change. What started as a campaign of erasure transformed into one of the most fascinating rehabilitations in royal history, a resurrection of reputation shaped by scholars, artists, and generations seeking truth behind the myth. The first stage of Anne's historical resurrection came quietly in the 17th and 18th centuries, when early historians began questioning the official Tudor narrative. Writers like Lord Herbert of Cherbury and later David Hume examined inconsistencies in the charges against her. They noted that the accusations of adultery and incest relied on contradictory testimony and impossible timelines. For the first time, Anne was portrayed not as a criminal, but as a victim of political convenience, a woman sacrificed to satisfy a monarch's desire for control. During the Victorian era, her story found new life through popular biographies. Authors such as Agnes Strickland and Paul Friedman humanized Anne, describing her as intelligent, cultured, and misunderstood. Their accounts focused on her education, her refinement, and her role in religious reform rather than her supposed moral failings. Victorian readers, fascinated by the idea of female virtue under persecution, began to see Anne as a tragic heroine. Her story fit neatly into the moral framework of the age, a woman destroyed by ambition and male tyranny, but dignified in suffering. The 20th century marked a turning point. With access to state papers, ambassadorial letters, and court transcripts, historians began reconstructing the actual sequence of events leading to her downfall. Scholars such as Eric Ives, Retha Warnica, and G.W. Bernard transformed Anne from a mythological figure into a complex political actor. Ives's work in particular portrayed her as a woman of vision, an advocate for education and reform whose intelligence made her dangerous to powerful men. This shift from moral judgment to political analysis redefined her legacy entirely. In modern historiography, Anne Boleyn is often viewed through the lens of gender and power dynamics. Researchers highlight how her downfall exemplified the vulnerability of women in patriarchal systems, especially those who wielded influence. Her intelligence, once described as arrogance, is now recognized as strategic awareness. Her assertiveness, once labeled manipulation, is understood as survival in a volatile court. Modern historians agree that Anne was neither saint nor seductress, but a product of her time, ambitious, articulate, and unyielding in a world that demanded female silence. Anne's resurrection extended beyond academic circles into art, film, and literature. From John Fox's Book of Martyrs to Hilary Mantel's Wolf Hall trilogy, her portrayal evolved with each era's moral code. In the 20th century, films like Anne of the Thousand Days, 1969, and television dramas such as The Tudors introduced her to global audiences as a woman of strength and tragedy. These portrayals, while dramatized, sparked renewed public interest in her real story, a sign that her execution no longer defined her legacy. What makes Anne's historical resurrection unique is that it occurred not through royal pardon or institutional revision, but through persistent re-examination by ordinary people, historians, writers, and viewers who refused to accept the narrative imposed by her enemies. Each generation reinterpreted her story to reflect its own struggles with power, gender, and justice. Today, Anne Boleyn stands as both symbol and warning. To historians, she represents the danger of political manipulation and the fragility of truth in statecraft. To feminists, she embodies the early struggle of a woman asserting agency in a patriarchal society. To the public, she remains one of history's most compelling enigmas, a queen who lost her life but gained immortality through the power of narrative. Her execution was meant to silence her forever. Instead, it ensured that she would be studied, debated, and remembered for centuries. Modern visitors to the Tower of London still leave flowers on her unmarked grave, not because of her crown, but because of what her story represents, the endurance of truth against distortion. Anne Boleyn's historical resurrection is not about rewriting her as flawless or victimized. It is about restoring complexity to a woman who is deliberately simplified by those who feared her. Through centuries of revision and rediscovery, she has transcended the propaganda that once buried her name. What remains today is not the caricature of a scheming mistress, but the portrait of a queen whose downfall exposed the darkest side of power, and whose memory continues to challenge the world that condemned her. Centuries after her death, Anne Boleyn remains one of history's most dissected women, not because of her short reign as queen, but because of what her life and death reveal about obsession, power, and human nature. Her story, once confined to dusty chronicles and royal archives, now exists in every form of modern culture, documentaries, novels, television dramas, and even social media debates. Few figures from the 16th century command the same fascination. What began as a Tudor scandal has evolved into a cultural mirror reflecting how societies perceive ambition, femininity, and injustice. In modern consciousness, Anne's image oscillates between empowerment and tragedy. She represents both the woman who defied convention and the victim of a system designed to punish such defiance. This duality explains her persistent appeal. She is neither saint nor sinner, but something far more recognizable, a complex human being navigating power in a world that demanded submission. The same qualities that doomed her in 1536, intelligence, wit, and independence, are the ones that make her relevant today. Television and film have played a central role in this reinterpretation. Productions such as The Tudors, 2007-2010, and BBC's Anne Boleyn, 2021, reframed her as a psychologically layered character, emphasizing her intelligence and emotional resilience rather than her supposed seduction. The camera often lingers not on her beauty, but on her intellect, the way she manipulates language, observes politics, and reads danger before others sense it. Modern portrayals focus less on romance with Henry VIII and more on her transformation from survivor to scapegoat. This shift reflects how 21st century audiences view women in positions of influence, capable, strategic, and often punished for it. Social media has also resurrected Anne's legacy in unexpected ways. Online forums, YouTube essays, and historical podcasts dissect every detail of her life, from her education in the Netherlands and France to her execution by French swordsmen. To many, Anne has become a symbol of female resilience in the face of systemic injustice. Her story circulates alongside modern discussions about workplace inequality, reputation, and public shaming. When people speak about the cost of being outspoken or the danger of threatening powerful men, Anne Boleyn's story often reemerges as a historical parallel. Psychologists and cultural theorists interpret her enduring presence as part of a broader human fascination with downfall, particularly the destruction of powerful women. The same collective curiosity that surrounds modern figures subjected to public humiliation mirrors the treatment Anne endured nearly 5 centuries ago. Her trial and execution represent an early form of character assassination, a spectacle of controlled narrative. In today's media-saturated world, her fate reads as a timeless warning about how easily truth can be distorted by power and popularity. The Anne Boleyn effect, as some scholars call it, captures this phenomenon, the idea that when a woman's ambition challenges established order, her character is attacked rather than her competence. The 16th century pamphlets accusing Anne of adultery and witchcraft were precursors to modern smear campaigns. The pattern, a powerful woman rising, public outrage growing, and eventual downfall engineered by those threatened, continues to resonate in the modern psyche. Modern feminism has reclaimed Anne as a proto-feminist figure, though not without debate. Some scholars argue she was not consciously fighting for women's equality, but for survival in a male-dominated court. Others view her as one of history's earliest examples of female agency, a woman who refused to accept her assigned place as mistress and instead demanded to be queen. Regardless of interpretation, her insistence on recognition transformed her from a background figure to a central player in England's most defining political upheaval, the break from Rome and the birth of the Church of England. The psychological fascination with Anne also lies in the contradictions she embodies. She was privileged yet powerless, loved yet hated, elevated yet destroyed. Her downfall satisfies a universal curiosity about the fragility of human success, how easily admiration turns to resentment, and how quickly favor becomes fatal. In that sense, her story transcends monarchy. It exposes a pattern of behavior that repeats across history, politics, and celebrity culture. Museums, historians, and even fashion designers continue to draw from Anne's aesthetic and symbolism. Her falcon emblem, her motto, the most happy, and even the bee necklace she famously wore have become icons of individuality and defiance. In exhibitions at the Tower of London and Hever Castle, visitors encounter not just her tragedy, but her intellect, her letters, musical compositions, and marginal notes in prayer books. Each rediscovered artifact counters centuries of erasure, reconstructing the woman behind the myth. Today, Anne Boleyn stands at the intersection of history and psychology. To historians, she represents the first modern queen, a political figure rather than a decorative consort. To artists, she is a muse of rebellion and endurance. To the public, she is both a cautionary tale and a symbol of defiance. Her execution no longer reads as the end of her story, but as the beginning of a centuries-long dialogue about truth, gender, and the abuse of power. Anne's cultural echo proves that historical narratives are never fixed. They evolve with the values of the societies that retell them. In the 16th century, she was the destroyer of kings. In the 19th, a tragic heroine. In the 21st, a voice that speaks to every woman who has been silenced by authority. The world that condemned her tried to erase her, but in doing so, ensured her immortality. 5 centuries have passed since the blade fell at the Tower of London, yet Anne Boleyn's shadow still moves across history. Her story refuses to die because it speaks to something timeless, the collision between human ambition and institutional power. Her rise reshaped religion, her fall redefined monarchy, and her memory continues to challenge the narratives written by her conquerors. What began as a royal scandal has become a mirror reflecting how civilizations treat women who refuse submission. The power structure that destroyed Anne did not simply end with her execution. Henry VIII's England thrived on control of narrative, religion, and perception. By executing Anne, Henry attempted to erase a mistake, to rewrite his legacy as one guided by divine justice rather than desire. But power built on fear always leaves cracks. In trying to erase her, Henry immortalized her. Her death did not silence her name, it embedded it into the consciousness of every generation that followed. Her influence extended far beyond her short life. The daughter she left behind, Elizabeth I, would grow to become one of the most powerful monarchs in history, intelligent, politically shrewd, and unyielding, much like her mother. The irony is profound. The woman Henry condemned for not giving him a son produced the queen who would secure the Tudor dynasty's glory. Through Elizabeth, Anne's spirit returned to the throne that had once cast her out, proving that influence, unlike power, cannot be executed. The psychological dimension of Anne's legacy is equally revealing. Her downfall demonstrates how quickly societies demonize women who disrupt expectations. Her confidence was recast as arrogance, her intelligence as deceit, her ambition as sin. This pattern continues in every era, reinforcing her story as a study of social control disguised as morality. To remember Anne accurately is to confront the mechanisms that still silence powerful women today, the character assassinations, the manipulative narratives, the cultural appetite for humiliation. From a political perspective, Anne's rise and fall signified a turning point. Her marriage triggered England's break with Rome, the dissolution of monasteries, and the birth of a national church. What was once dismissed as a personal scandal became one of Europe's greatest religious transformations. Behind the drama of her downfall lay an irreversible shift in authority, the beginning of a modern state that would place kings under law and expose the limits of divine right. Anne's execution symbolized the old world dying. Her influence helped forge the new. In historical studies, Anne Boleyn stands as the first casualty of political image warfare. Her life was dissected in pamphlets, rumors, and public displays meant to define her before history could. The speed with which she was condemned mirrors how propaganda functions today, fast, emotional, and absolute. Yet, centuries later, scholarship, art, and cultural memory have outlasted that machinery of lies. Every new discovery, a letter, a portrait, a prayer book note, becomes a quiet act of justice, reconstructing the woman behind the weaponized myth. Her immortality, paradoxically, lies in her vulnerability. Anne Boleyn was not perfect. She was ambitious, calculating, and sometimes ruthless, but she was real. Her flaws make her human, and her defiance makes her unforgettable. The monarchy that sought to erase her gave her something far greater than a crown, enduring relevance. In the grand architecture of history, Anne Boleyn's story endures because it forces confrontation with uncomfortable truths about gender, power, and the human instinct to destroy what cannot be controlled. She is not just a queen who died. She is a question that never stops being asked. What happens when a woman dares to want more than she's allowed?